So now, on to our speaker. Many of you probably know Will.
I went behind you.
Will Jaremko-Wright, our county agent here in Taos from the Ag Extension Office. He has been a faculty member at New Mexico State and New Mexico Highlands University. He lived in Las Vegas, New Mexico for 16 years while he attended New Mexico Highlands University and began his career as an ecologist. In addition to teaching, Will has conducted research and monitoring of birds and vegetation throughout the Southwest, with a particular interest in pinyon juniper ecosystems. He currently farms and raises livestock with his wife on the Acequia Madre del Rio Chiquito in Ranchos. Thank you, Will, for coming and talking about birds, bears, and berries.
Yeah, a lot of alliteration. Have catchy titles for this kind of thing, right? Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Will. I've met quite a few of you, and those of you that haven't, I look forward to getting to know you more. So this photo is from where a lot of the research that I'll be talking about today comes from. This is the Mesa de los Carros in eastern San Miguel County, about 30 miles east of Las Vegas. I conducted this all while I was a undergrad and graduate student at Highlands. And then we'll talk about it a little bit more as I taught at Highlands for 9 years. And once I kind of realized that every semester I had an army of little 18 and 19-year-olds with fingers and hands that could go to work and sort through juniper seeds and berries and collect data, I started putting them to work. So the second part of the talk is kind of stuff that happened while I was a faculty member there. So I'll talk a little bit about pinyon juniper ecosystems. Generally speaking, I'm going to be focusing on the expansion element of it, that we know that these ecosystems have increased in expanse in the last couple centuries or so. So we'll talk about juniper specifically. We'll talk about its dispersal ecology a little bit. And then we'll talk about tree populations, seedlings, a little bit about birds, and then some discussion and implications. So this talk is about, junipers on the move. And this was my field tech dog at the time, Marley, who's still with us. And he just barely escaped this juniper that was lurking in the background, ready to come get him, right? Crawling like an octopus or something. That's not typical. This is an area that had a lot of erosion, and you can see the entire erosive surface has been gone about 2 feet. So this area that I'm going to be talking about, sort of northeastern New Mexico generally, but also eastern San Miguel County, there's a fabulous book. I've got it right here. We Fed Them Cactus by Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca. It's excellent if you can find this. It's not really a novel per se. It's basically vignettes of her life growing up in eastern San Miguel County around the turn of the 20th century. She was a school teacher. She went to school at Highlands. She taught at La Liendre down in Santa Rosa in Guadalupe County. And then she actually got a master's degree and became an extension agent with NMSU. And once she did that, she was fluent in Spanish, Tiwa, and Tewa. She was actually the family consumer science agent for all of northern New Mexico from about 1920 to 1950, which was an amazing time to be an extension agent. So I want to read a little bit from this book about this country that we're going to be talking about. There's not a lot of public land out in that part of the world, so a lot of people don't have a lot of exposure to the pinyon juniper canyon lands in San Miguel County. A lot of people just drive by it on I-25. They kind of see a bunch of grass out there. They think there's maybe not too much out there. But Fabiola wrote, "The Llano is a great plateau. Its 60,000 square miles tip almost imperceptibly from 5,500 feet above sea level to 2,000 feet in northwest Texas. Between these boundaries are the settlements, whistle stops, trading posts, chapels, ranch headquarters, homesteaders' houses, some new, some old, many abandoned, which tell the story of more than 100 years of living on the Llano. Curving along the Llano's high northern and western rim is the caprock, the rough-hewn ceja, or eyebrow, above the plain. From Canyon de Agua Hill to Luciano Mesa, the vegetation includes juniper, piñón, yucca, mesquite, sagebrush, grama, and buffalo grasses, as well as limita, prickly pear, and pitaya. There are wildflowers in abundance, and when the spring comes, the earth abounds in all colors imaginable. The fields of oregano and cactus were in full bloom, can complete with the loveliest of gardens. It's a lonely land because of its immensity, but it lacks nothing for those who enjoy nature in her full grandeur. The colors of the skies, of the hills, the rocks, the birds, the flowers are soothing to the most troubled heart. It is loneliness without despair, The whole world seems to be there, full of promise and gladness. So I love that comment, that line there, loneliness without despair, right? This is a wide open, rugged landscape. There is no one that lives there. I take that back. There's a few people that live out there, but there's basically no one that lives there. You can go for 20, 30 miles without seeing a house, without seeing another person. And when I was doing field work in this type of country, I'd often, you could easily go a week without talking to anybody. So all of this kind of countryside that she's talking about there is what we refer to sometimes as the Comancheria, right? The stomping grounds of the Comanche back in the day. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that history in a little bit, but this was an area that didn't have a whole lot of settlements, but certainly in the past, there was a lot of people. A lot more people lived there back then than live there today, okay? As many of you know, most of New Mexico's settlements are mostly here on the Rio Grande area, and really there was very few settlements to the east of that. San Miguel de Vado, which is basically Villanueva of today, established in 1790s or so, Las Vegas around 1835 or so, so fairly late in New Mexico's history. But this kind of Comancheria area, again, was populated by a lot of people. This is a rock, a sandstone outcropping at Autograph Rock near Boise City, Oklahoma, so on the Oklahoma side of the Panhandle. It's Narciso Trujillo from Ocate, 1893, okay? Now this was, long past the time of the bison, but this is a place where ciboleros were going to hunt bison out there in the plains, and there was a lot of trade back and forth in that time period before the fencing of the land. So if you'd like to know more about that, please read Mrs. De Baca's book. Now, I came to this country when I was in school. I moved to Las Vegas when I was 18, went to Highlands. And our coach would always take us out into this canyon country and drop us down at places like La Liendre or San Agustin, like Lower Guaymas Canyon. He'd literally drop us off there and then drive back to Vegas, and we would all just run back, 15, 16 miles back to Las Vegas. So I kind of learned about this canyon country in an interesting way. And when I was in college, I had a lot of energy and a chainsaw and a pickup truck, and I got hired on a couple of ranches to do thinning work. And this was a NRCS project. It was going to be they had to redo this fence. The fence had probably been built in the 19-teens or so. It was falling apart. They had to redo it. So I went along and cut down every single juniper that was growing along about 5 miles of this fence. We sold all the postas. We sold all the firewood. It was a lot of time out there thinking about juniper, and a lot of time out there thinking about, why are all these juniper growing on the fences? Man, this is inconvenient. What's up with that? Why are all these junipers on the fences? What's going on with this ecosystem? Okay, so I'll come back to that fence line here in a little bit. So pinon juniper ecosystems are geographically widespread. About 25% of New Mexico is covered in PJ. It is PJ, by the way. Please don't say JP. People say juniper pinon. It just sounds, Rob agrees with it, it just sounds wrong. It's pinon juniper. Okay, and it really comes in two distinct phases, and we could maybe add a few more in there if we really wanted to, but persistent woodlands, we think of this as sort of the old growth woodlands, right? They're morphologically old trees. There's about a 1-to-1 ratio of pinon to juniper. There's Rocky Mountain juniper mixed in there. There's a high Quercus gricia, gray oak component in there, depending on where you are. Steep, rocky terrain, escarpments, mesas, canyons, what we say is shallow skeletal soils, right? These are places where there's a lot of fire refuge. It's hard for fire to move through these areas. The other kind of form of pinon juniper is really a savanna, okay? Fun fact, the word savanna that we use in English, the Spanish version is sabana with a B. The Spanish word for juniper is sabino, okay? So the words sabina and sabana actually are very much closely related, coming from those Juniperus thurifera Spanish juniper savannas of Spain. But these kind of savannas are dominated by junipers. There's a lot of younger trees. There's very flat plains and valleys, really depositional soils. Tend to be well-drained, clay, sandy, whatever, but a lot of non-rock component, typically good for grasslands. So this is a picture actually from here in Taos County. This is on Cerro Chiflo on the other side of the gorge from some forestry work I was doing years ago. It was actually just following a thinning project, but it's still super dense in there. We've got old pinon and old juniper. You can actually see some mistletoe right there. This would be pretty distinctive of those kind of older stands. And then we have savannas. Juniper savannas typically max out around 30 to 40% tree cover. This picture looks terrible. This was in March of 2013 after 3 years of really intense drought. The blue grama and buffalo grass that's in this inner space was starting to die back, which is difficult to do. It's blue grama and buffalo grass is pretty tough. But these typically max out around 30 to 40% because unlike a popular myth, junipers don't actually just do a taproot. Like most conifers, they have nice lateral roots. And so a lot of this inner space probably has juniper roots throughout it. So it's sort of already at maximum capacity. Now this is when things look really rough. You wait till it greens up out there and it is beautiful. There is few things as beautiful as a green grass, middle of the monsoon, juniper savanna. It's absolutely lovely. And as Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca mentioned, it's a garden. I mean, really. So these kind of savannas and woodlands are often adjacent to each other because of geomorphic heterogeneity. We've got rocky outcrops. This is the ceja, the eyebrow or cap rock of the Canadian escarpment. It's about 7,000 feet up here. It's about 5,600 feet down here. So this is a big mesa. It's 12, 1,300 feet. We've got nice depositional soils down here, and of course, nice savanna type structure. Now, junipers we'll talk a lot today about juniper expansion, and the encroachment of woody plants into grasslands isn't like a New Mexico specific thing. You can look at the literature from South Africa, Australia, South America, and of course here in North America with a variety of species where places that were grasslands, and we'll talk about how those were maintained, have kind of become woodified. Perennial woody plants growing in places that they historically probably weren't. So one-seed juniper, I'm not even going to use scientific names today, guys. I'm using the four-letter alpha codes. So that's Jumo, Juniperus monosperma. Has been anecdotally observed encroaching into grasslands, but there wasn't really a lot of empirical data for ecological restoration planning. There's been a lot of work with ponderosa pine, a lot of work with mixed conifer about how long historic fire return intervals were. But pinyon juniper is sort of a forgotten child, so to speak, of the forestry world. Junipers aren't, for a forester, they're like not really a tree, so they didn't really get researched very much for a long time. For the range ecology folks, it's more likely a problem, so they didn't really research it much either. So it's sort of been forgotten about a little bit. There's some useful definitions, just expansion, encroachment, and infill. They all mean slightly different things. We won't cut hairs too much about that, split hairs about that. Now, we do have some interesting historic records of change. These photos are from Barbara Salick's 1986 master's thesis as NMSU. It's not published anywhere, but you can find it online. And she looked at photo documenting vegetative change throughout New Mexico in a variety of ecosystem types. It is an awesome resource. The PDF is online. There's really cool photos from around the state. And so this is all the ones in the Pinon Juniper complexes. This is out in McKinley County, so western New Mexico. We've got 78 years of change there. This is Pecos National Historic Park in San Miguel. We've got, 60 years of change here. This is Roe Mesa. So I-25 goes right at the base of this. So you're looking back towards Pecos, back towards the national park. 1916. And if you've driven by there today, it's pretty dense woodland, like heavily dense woodland. Okay? And here's up near Clayton, Union County, 1897. By 1984, we can see a lot of increase in trees here. We can spot a linear feature here, probably a fence line right there going at the base of that kind of wash there. So we do have some photographic evidence of this kind of phenomenon happening. Closer to Las Vegas, this is a paper by Fred Emerson, who is a professor at New Mexico Normal University. That's Highlands. Normal universities were teachers' colleges. They changed the name in the 50s. So Fred was the biologist there for the university, and he published this in Ecology, like the major ecology journal. He might be the last person from Highlands to publish in Ecology, to be honest. It's a very prestigious journal. And he wrote about the tension zone between the grama grass and the Pinon Juniper Association in northeastern New Mexico in 1932. When I started going to school at Highlands and I read this paper, I immediately said, I know where that is. If you leave Las Vegas, going southeast, you can take County Road C-23, and this is a back way to the Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge. There's the refuge starting there. There's I-25. At this point here, you're looking back at this little mesa right here, and it's gone from that to that in about 90 years. I took this photo just a couple years ago. So again, that to that. High-tech CGI there. Okay. So some relevant New Mexico history, 1830s Las Vegas land grant and the original Baca land grant, which later turned into the Bell Ranch outside Tucumcari, was awarded 1830s. 1846, of course, James Kearney and the Army of the West invaded New Mexico. Their first stop was actually Las Vegas. They came down from Trinidad and Colorado. They stood on the plaza, and it was the first time the U.S. Army has ever been an occupying force in a foreign country. And he read out this declaration. It's still there in a plaque on the plaza. By 1870s, Comanche and Kiowa were forcibly removed from the area to reservations elsewhere. By 1875, the BNSF Railroad connected Las Vegas to Kansas City stockyards, and this really marked a big change for New Mexico agriculture. Historically, before this period, you could have a whole lot of livestock in the middle of nowhere, but who's going to eat them, right? Animals lose a lot of weight if you're trailing them thousands of miles to a major market. It wasn't until the railroads came in that we really see an increase in what we might today consider industrialized or large-scale agriculture. Okay? This was also post-Civil War, so there was a lot of ranches from Texas and ranchers that came from Texas post-Civil War into eastern New Mexico as well. 1890s, we kind of see a historic peak in livestock population. Just to give you some ideas, we don't have good data for the 1890s, but by 1920, there were 4 million cattle and sheep in New Mexico. By the 1940s and post-World War II, a lot of rural New Mexico, places like La Liendre, where Fabiola was from, places like Wagamound, they would never see the same kind of populations ever again. Basically a depopulation. People moved to major cities. They left the ranches. They left the small communities. And by 2020, to give in perspective, we have 1.4 million cattle and sheep in the state today. That's an updated, that's actually a 2023 number. Now, ruminant animals eat stuff. They eat a lot of grass, obviously, right? They got to feed that rumen. And especially back in that time period of the late 19th century, we're talking about a lot of animals on the landscape. Now, when we see that depopulation of these areas, a lot of homes, structures, ranch houses were just left. You kind of become immune to it living in eastern New Mexico of just seeing lots and lots of ruins, like lots of them, stone houses, yeah.
Was there also an accompanying degradation of the range?
We'll get to that, yeah. So a lot of these houses, people just kind of left, and of course the junipers take over, right? There's a nice healthy juniper growing inside a stone house. Here's a cholla growing inside an old stone house. The architecture is amazing. These structures are still very much strong. So again, yeah, we see that large scale. This is actually by John Collier. Many of you all know Robin Collier. This is his dad when he was a WPA Farm Service photographer back in the 40s. So we never really would see that number of livestock ever again. To put it in full perspective, this is a graph of New Mexico's human population in orange. The black is actually cattle population, so it's remained fairly constant through the years, but it's really the sheep industry that's taken the biggest hit, right? We see the biggest highs late 1920s, right before the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. We've got a slight decrease there, goes up again. The 1950s drought totally wiped out that industry, and of course the wool industry and a lot of things that went with that. It wasn't until the early 2000s that humans, for the first time, outnumbered cattle and sheep in the state of New Mexico. So, despite pretty relatively sustainable grazing management and livestock numbers over the last, 80 years or so, since the 1950s and 60s, since things like Extension Service and NRCS and things like that, the consequences of the 19th century and successive droughts in the 19-teens, the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1960s have all kind of taken their toll on the ability of these grasslands to carry a fire. Okay? Now, again, this is taken during a really rough time period. This area had been destocked by this time period, but again, you're not going to have a fire in this kind of landscape. Now, the following monsoon season, all of this bare ground, I'll tell you, filled up with purslane and a whole bunch of other stuff. It was pretty incredible, the comeback that it made that year. March 2013, Rob, you might have been around. This was when Las Vegas had that major flooding. September 2013, big floods, and we had a really big monsoon season that year. So this area looks very different now, but during drought, it looks pretty rough. So grasslands obviously burn. They have fires. This is the Smokehouse Creek fire, which is ongoing currently, right? 1 million acres and counting. Grasslands burn. Historically, they burned. We have taken kind of a long pause from that kind of fire regime in grasslands. We graze areas, we have fire breaks, we have a lot of cropland mixed in there that's not going to carry fires, but occasionally, and especially this time of year, we can see what those kind of fires can do, right? Pretty tragic situation. So the explanatory causes of woody plant encroachment and juniper encroachment are pretty well developed. It's kind of a result of reduced fire frequency through indirect causes like grazing and direct fire suppression causes, good old Smokey the Bear. And then also biological inertia. This is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. There's not a lot of, you won't open up a textbook and see a lot of that, but think about that idea of inertia, right? Once you get an object in motion, it kind of keeps going. How many of you have juniper on your property? Has it ever shown signs of drought stress? A little bit, some flagging maybe? Largely no. I've lived in the Las Vegas area through presumably the driest 20 years in the history of the area, and there's no junipers that entirely died. It's nothing like pinon, right? Pinon's pretty drought intolerant. So this biological inertia idea is that trees might establish during wet periods. 1980s were very wet, 1970s were very wet, 1940s were very wet. And then they can maintain during those climatically unfavorable time periods. So they get established during a wet decade, and then they just kind of coast through those dry periods. The dispersal ecology of junipers is so efficient and well adapted to colonization of available space that it just takes a few years of wet conditions for those seeds to get out there in the landscape and to get seeds germinated and new recruits. So tree migrations, if we really want to think about how they move around the landscape, unlike the promotional image I sent where it looks like there's a juniper that's walking, right? They can't walk. They have to rely on seed dispersal. And tree migrations consist of very frequent short distance dispersal, right? It's easy to imagine a seed falling from a tree or a bird eats it and lands somewhere nearby. And that happens a lot. There's a lot of seed that's nearby, right? And then we also have more infrequent long-distance dispersal. Those occasional American robins or bluebirds that are going to fly 6-7 miles across the landscape into somewhere new, deposit some seeds over there. And then, of course, once we have this situation, they can kind of backfill. So I call this the leap and fill sort of tree migration. Now, this is actually from my old master's advisor, Ken Benson, who's now retired. He looked at regeneration waves, and he was obviously my advisor, big influence on me. And he had a similar idea, the same kind of leap and fill idea, but he thought that you could probably measure this by looking at the reproductive population. If your source population is from here, and your trees are moving with distance on the landscape, that source seed rain, or dispersal of seed, is going to be really heavy close by. Those areas are going to establish and then reach sexual maturity, and then seed rain goes a little bit farther out in the landscape. Those seeds establish as sexually mature trees, and then those rain seed onto the landscape. So it's sort of a wave of trees migrating across the landscape. Why do trees need to do that? Well, this is the Jansen-Connell hypothesis from the 1970s. Basically that it's not good for a seed to land underneath their parent, right? Just like you all kind of, we encourage the 18-year-olds to get out of the house and go do something else and, come back, but, get out here for a little while. The number of seeds per unit area is going to decrease with distance away from the parent. A lot of it's going to be nearby. But of course, it's going to be harder. The probability of establishing and recruitment is going to be higher the farther away you get from that parent tree. So the population recruitment curve is sort of a Goldilocks zone. A little bit far away, but not too far away. Far enough away to limit competition with the parent, but still close enough that you've got plenty of seeds that are going to sprout. Now for wind dispersed seeds, like the elms that are everybody see, they're all budded out, they're about to flower like crazy. When these drop their seeds next month, if you've got a big elm tree nearby, basically the number of seeds decreases monotonically with distance away from your tree, your source population. With bird dispersed or zoonotic dispersed species like juniper, we see a different pattern. It's not a nice uniform curve. It tends to be concentrated around recruitment foci or perches, right? Places where the animals are going to be hanging out. In the case of a bird, it might be a perch. In the case of a bear, it might be a big pile of bear scat where there might be 3,000 seeds in one pile, right? So these trees can produce a lot of berries. Now, are these actually berries? No, very good, right. They're conifers. They can't produce berries. Berries are for angiosperms. So these are a modified cone with a fleshy pericarp. I'm not going to talk about it any more than that. For these purposes, it acts like a berry, right? There's a seed in there. There's a little bit of a sweet, goody package of sugar in there. It's about 1 calorie per berry, actually. So if you ate, and vitamin C, high in vitamin C. If you ate 2,000 of them, you would get really sick with all the tannins. It wouldn't be very nice. So don't try that. Don't try to do your daily diet with juniper berries. But a mature female, this was, when I was doing my master's thesis, this is what the female trees look like. It was a big year during drought, and they were loaded, okay? I have not attempted to quantify the number of seeds. I pulled that from a research paper from the 70s where some poor grad student had to go out and can't count seeds. So there's a lot of seeds on there. They go into a bird. They come out a bird, right? So that fence line I talked about earlier, they show up on landscapes. Very handy on Google Earth when you're looking for fences in juniper country. You can always spot a fence, right? Now, this is a lot of bird food. Not all birds are effective dispersers. This is actually a Cassin's finch. They're more of a masticator. That Cassin's finch will actually strip away some of the fleshy parts, and then it'll mash the seed and crush that and then consume that and digest that. So not an effective disperser for something like a Cassin's finch. But for stuff like mountain bluebirds, American robins, you know, it's a major food resource. And it's pretty amazing how many birds are out there in these pinyon juniper ecosystems. Dead of winter, not a lot going on. There's a lot of birds. There's juniper seeds to eat, there's pinyon to eat, and there's birds like this Cooper's hawk that, of course, eat other birds. I took a picture of this bird. I flushed it. Most of the photos in this are mine, but I'll point out the ones that aren't. I flushed this bird. It was actually eating a mountain bluebird. So for years, I had this great collection of mountain bluebird feathers that were fresh. I mean, it was like from that guy. Now, the role of mammals. Like I mentioned, it's dry out there in the wintertime. This is a jackrabbit that's been munching on a cactus, and you'll see this when you start looking around for it. This is a bear scat. This is an 8x11 data sheet that I was using at the time. So, you know, any guesses on how many seeds are in that? You know, a couple thousand potentially, right? So mammals also play an important role. It's not something that I've looked at specifically, but the literature's out there. I didn't take any of these photos, by the way, so this is my disclaimer of fair use, Creative Commons, blah, 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 whatever. But junipers are really dispersed in 2 phases, and there's been some interesting work on this recently up in Oregon with Juniperus occidentalis. Junipers are really, we now think that they're dispersed through what we call diplochory. Diplochory is a 2-bit fancy word for meaning 2 phases of seed dispersal. Basically, there's a primary dispersal by birds, coyotes, bears, where there's a lot, you know, a bear scat with a lot of seeds right there. Evolutionarily, that's not great for the seed. If you're with 2,000 other seeds in a little tight pocket, the chances of germination and, you know, you just don't want that kind of competition. But the secondary dispersal is something we're learning about more and more, that rodents like pack rats or field mice, deer mice, even ants, take those packets of seeds and then go cache those underground. And potentially that's how we're getting germination. So there's a lot still to learn on this process. It's pretty cool. This is the only picture I have on a bear. I only put the bear on the title because it was alliterative. Sorry. Okay, so when I was in school, the historic distribution and structure of woodlands was not understood. There was actually some contention whether juniper savannas existed pre-settlement or pre-1860s. The spatial patterns of expansion weren't really documented. Seedling ecology wasn't documented. There's a lot of evidence that other places, junipers or arid environments, tree species need a nurse plant, so a plant that's going to shade and make the conditions for germination and establishment better. Okay, and we didn't know that about juniper. And then studies of bird dispersers had also not really been carried out. There was one article from New Mexico in 1978 by a guy from UNM, Salmonson, and he was on the backside of the Sandias in what was pretty persistent woodland, old growth woodland, a lot of ponderosa. And he said that Townsend solitaires were the major disperser. Well, you go into these places and solitaires are around in small numbers, but they're not in, not by the thousands like we see with bluebirds and robins. So the original intent of the research was to describe the historic distribution of juniper populations, their post-settlement population growth rates. We wanted to see if this regeneration wave if it fits this model, and we were looking at, do juniper seedlings require a nurse plant to establish? Do we need that for this kind of process to be happening? And we also wanted to characterize the avian disperser community. I had a lot of time in my hands in grad school, so I was like, yeah, I'll do the birds too, why not? This is the study area. It's all private rangeland, a couple big ranches. This is about 30 miles, 20 kilometers, so what was that? 30 miles from Las Vegas. So kind of central eastern San Miguel County. But I'd say, again, this is pretty representative of this whole part of New Mexico in here. It's actually where 3 ecoregions come together. Again, this is higher elevation, upper Canadian Plateau, the Canadian Canyon ecoregion, and then the Conchas and Pecos Plains. So kind of spanning a pretty wide area. This is what the sampling design kind of looked like. So there was 33 overall plots. They were along a topoedaphic gradient. I made a lot of these slides when I was in grad school, and I was using a lot of words that I shouldn't use anymore. But anyway, topo means topographic. Edaphic just refers to the soil type. So we had a variety of soil types, a variety of topographic features. The areas in hashed black are escarpment, rocky. This is like Chinle Formation, Dakota sandstone. It's all rocky outcrops. So we had plots at higher elevation savanna, escarpment woodlands, lower elevation savanna close by, and lower elevation savanna far away. And I'm going to talk later about near and far savannas. So basically we cut off about 500 meters from the escarpment. We called everything here close and everything here far away. Okay, and you'll see some data that shows that here in a minute.
So,
Yeah.
how did you determine the original from where it was being dispersed?
So
Trees?
age of the trees, just knowing about these escarpment areas, that they're really old. And we cut down and aged about 200 trees in total. And I'll get to that in a second. And I'll show you the data. You can take a photo of it and use the numbers if you want. This is what that landscape looks like. So can you spot that sort of soil boundary in this image? You can kind of see it sort of, there's kind of a change somewhere in here. It's about there, right? And so again, up here, rocky, down here, well-drained soils. I'm not going to really talk about the methods a lot because it was a long time ago, to be honest. But we did a lot of data collection. It was a lot of very sciencey stuff. Yeah. Okay. So this is how we established population curves. What we did is we cut down trees. We took all our quantitative measurements of it, and then we took it back to our lab, sanded them down, did the dendrochronological work. We did divide up escarpment trees and savanna trees. Nice, tight-fitting regression models, right? Liked seeing that back in the day. If you want to know how old your juniper trees are, I suggest, depending on what kind of soil you're in, you could use one of these equations. You just plop in your diameter in inches as x, and that'll give you the age as y, right? So we basically took this and we applied it to something like 2,000 trees that we had measured over the course of the study. From that, we get population curves. This is showing the percentage of total juniper population in savannas and escarpment settings and the year that those stems established. We had the oldest stem that I measured was from 1665, I think. And that tree had like 8 stems. I just took one of them. Savannas, though, again, you can kind of see something dramatic happens around 1870. We found one tree from like 1858 that was super close by. We didn't find anything out there older than about 150 years old. Okay. Now, we had 2 different study locations, these 2 different mesas. The escarpment populations are in red. Our vertical axis here is cumulative trees per acre. So this is basically a population curve increasing over time. And what I want to point out is that in both locations, the escarpment population and the savanna populations have increased. It's not one or the other. Those old growth woodlands have also densified pretty rapidly since about the 1980s. Turned out the 80s were very wet and a whole lot of seeds got established back in the 80s. Okay? Now then what we did is we took these savanna locations and we wanted to know is there a difference between near and far sites? Well, we took those and broke them up into near and far, and that's what those two populations look like. The near savannas have something like 800 trees per hectare, which is a whole lot, like 400 trees per acre. Okay, more so, their populations are higher than the escarpment areas. So these populations have just absolutely exploded. The places that are more than 500 meters away, though, pretty flat. I mean, it's increased from nothing, but it's a kind of a linear increase, not really going too, we wouldn't call that exponential, right? So the near savanna populations have increased at a much faster rate than those places that are very far away. Remember, we're trying to test that regeneration wave kind of model, okay? Then what we looked at, and I got a nice, again, fancy high-tech drawing down here. I drew it with my mouse. Here we're looking at reproductive trees per hectare, so basically a function of the reproductively mature population size. This is our distance to the escarpment, to those escarpment soils. So putting that boundary right here, so we're looking just at the savannas here. And this isn't, an R-square of, 0.7 or something, but this was statistically significant. We see this nice decrease of reproductive individuals with distance away from those source populations. Okay, again, giving evidence, to that regeneration wave model. When we look at the stand age, however, same graph, but just stand age. This is the oldest tree in the stand, kind of flatline, statistically significant, poor relationship. Basically, there's trees that established back in the, decent time ago, pretty far away, okay? Again, that leap and fill model. We have infrequent dispersal really far away. There's just not a lot of it. So our reproductive individuals goes down with distance. The stand age is kind of all over the place, pretty much a scattershot, okay? So this was kind of a model that we developed to illustrate this regeneration wave idea. You've got, again, our distance from the escarpment, the reproductive individuals in the population. So the areas that are close by got established pretty early on. Then they rain seed a little bit farther away. Then they rain seed a little bit farther away, while there's infrequent dispersal to these far locations. Okay, so we kind of have a regeneration wave and leap and fill kind of model. Okay, and it's kind of fun to think about this when you're researching this. You're looking at, we were aging trees that were 200, 100, 300 years old. So you're really looking at landscape century time scales, but you're also looking at what's going on with the seeds within a given year. So two very different time scales, right? Individual animals are taking those seeds, dispersing individual seeds. The overall effect is a century worth of ecosystem change. Okay? So the reproductive population density was strongly influenced by distance from the source population. The stand establishment date was not really influenced by distance. That kind of matches this leap and fill model pretty well. Okay, now that wasn't it. That was a whole lot of research. That was an entire chapter of the master's thesis. But we weren't done there. We also wanted to look at this idea of, do juniper seedlings need nurse plants? Okay, so what we did is every one of those plots that we were measuring, we looked at the percentage of available cover. So in savanna locations, the cover is in blue. So open intercanopy. This is like non-treed grassy. 78% of the cover is that. Only 18% of the cover on average were juniper stems. Unsurprisingly, we found only 7% of the seedlings in the open, while we found about 88% of the seedlings underneath those trees. So a lot of these juniper seedlings are right underneath the crown, kind of against that Jansen-Connell hypothesis that we want to get seeds far away. So a lot of seeds just fall underneath these trees and establish. They're probably not going to make it to maturity. These open area ones, though, are likely to make maturity, likely to produce lots of seeds, get pollinated, get dispersed, etc. What was interesting about this is that male and female well, this really should say non-coning trees, so it includes some immature trees that we couldn't sex quite yet. But it was pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio of male to female. But male junipers still had about 28% of the seedlings underneath the male trees. Because birds still go and land on a male tree just to digest, and they still poop out seeds underneath those male trees. So there's still some effects going on with the male trees there. There was a very interesting relationship with choyas. So here we have a young tree. This is probably about a 30-year-old juniper, which puts it about this tall out in this kind of country. They are slow growing. And it's growing right up underneath a dead, well, it was still alive, but a dying choya. Now, choya does not like to germinate underneath something else. Choya wants to be wide open, full sunlight. You don't tend to find healthy choyas growing underneath the canopy of junipers very often. 25% of the adult trees had live, like barely alive, or more likely skeletal choya remains underneath the junipers. Some of these junipers are massive, like you guys have probably seen them from here to the wall, right? It's kind of the canopy drip line. These are big trees, and right in the middle of it would be a nicely skeletalized choya that's probably been there for quite a long time. When we look at certain time periods like 50 years ago, 40 years ago, something closer to 45% of the junipers had choya below their canopy. Okay? So what's going on there? Well, if you're spending time out there watching birds, you will see a lot of birds perching on choya, like a lot, all the time. This mountain bluebird, this was an afternoon, and this is in March, so they're still around this, they migrate and they altitudinally migrate. So these birds were probably feeding on juniper in the morning. It warms up a little bit at this lower elevation. Then they go out here and they start to hunt. Mountain bluebirds are very good flycatchers, very good foragers. They're looking for ground beetles, like the one you always see, the obscura is the species epithet. Wolf spiders, tarantulas, kind of anything that's like walking around out here, they will hunt. So they're out there, they're hunting, they're going back to their favorite choya perches. So there's a lot of birds potentially spending time out there in these areas. Okay. Now, the seedling density, again, was mostly underneath these juniper canopies, more so into the female trees, but we still had some of the male trees. But again, ecologically, these seedlings growing in the open are super important. Those are going to be our individuals recruited into the population in the future. Now, in 2013, when I was a grad student, I thought to myself, man, I wish I had like another couple years to start looking at how do these different seedlings growing in the open, growing under a juniper canopy, or a male tree or a female tree, how do they grow? Like what's their growth rates? Do you actually have an effect of their growth rate depending on where they're growing? I obviously didn't have time for that at the time, but by 2021, I had a whole bunch of little helpers running around in the woods that needed to do labs. About 2020, well, pre-pandemic, we started getting away from sort of the biology class canned labs where everyone does the same lab every semester, and it's like a tabletop experiment, and it shows something, but you do it for 1 week, and then you move on, and the students have forgotten about it like a month later. They don't even know what the principles were of that lab. We've gotten away from that at most universities, and we started to do these kind of extended labs, like maybe 12 weeks or 10 weeks of working on a central project, working towards a nice finished product like lab report or poster presentation. So I started coming up with just ideas, and then I would have the students fill in what their variables that they were going to test were. So some of the ones that we kind of hit on and did the most work on included how does the microsite influence those seedling growth rates? And do junipers nurse greater diversity of perennial plants than those open areas? Because it's arid and it's hot, do you actually find more perennial woody plants underneath the canopy of the juniper than you do out here in the open? That's one of the questions we wanted to ask. So they produced some nice posters. You guys can obviously read that, so I don't have to talk about it. I'm just kidding. I will point out the title, No Need for a Nurse. Basically what we found was that the junipers have no requirement for nurse plants. There might be more seeds underneath and seedlings underneath those trees, but once they get in the open, that's 7% of the seedlings that are out in the open, they're going to grow really well. We first had to establish a allometric relationship between size and age. We did that on biomass, height, and diameter. We felt pretty good about these kind of curves. Using this, we felt confident that we could look at growth rates as a measure of productivity, that the trees do in fact get taller with age, they get more diameter with age, their biomass increases with age. So what we found was in the open, diameter growth is higher than underneath female or male juniper trees, and under we had a few Siberian elms. This is not super significant because we only had like 12 samples of this, but I wanted to include it because it was interesting. The biomass growth rate, though, look at that, under a Siberian elm. If you're a juniper growing underneath an elm, think about what that gives you. Shade in the summer, full sun in the wintertime, so you're not competing for sunlight throughout the entire year. So they do pretty well underneath deciduous trees. So juniper seedlings growing below Siberian elms, yeah, do pretty well. But yeah, the junipers in the open settings grow faster in terms of their diameter and biomass. Not necessarily height. This was interesting. Juniper seedlings in the open, much lower height growth rate than underneath those trees. And that kind of makes sense, right? You've probably seen this in your yard or something. A young seedling that's really striving for light is going to get kind of stemmy and tall. Whereas if you're out in the open, you don't have to worry about height. It's windy in Las Vegas. Being tall is not necessarily a good thing. They start to take on that kind of clumpy shape at this kind of early age, actually. Okay. We also looked at nurse plant protege interactions. The protege would be the thing growing underneath the nurse plant. Okay. And the students looked at perennial woody species below those nurse trees. So those were mature male, mature female junipers, pinon, ponderosa, and elms. They also recorded species densities of, this is things like cholla, yucca, any of our cacti, other junipers, or other woody plant seedlings. And then they also calculated the Shannon-Weiner diversity index. This is just a metric for comparing two types of diversity to each other. So female trees have pretty diverse undercanopies, but interestingly, the non-juniper seedling densities are in red. Male trees actually have quite a bit going on underneath them. A lot of yuccas were underneath them for some reason. I'm not entirely sure. The open areas had about 0.32 individuals per square meter comparatively, so kind of in that same ballpark, but of course very few juniper seedlings shown in the green. So the open areas and the under canopy of the junipers was actually pretty similar. No statistical difference between these three. For diversity index, the female junipers actually had the most diversity in terms of their relative abundance and number of species. You can find some really cool stuff when you start looking underneath these female junipers. You know, there's species of native bindweeds, native morning glories. You'll find Echinocereus cacti under there. You'll find the clare cups, all those. So pretty cool when you start poking around underneath these. Now, we had already looked at the distribution of adult junipers. We looked at the distribution of seedling junipers. And the last project I worked on with students in spring 2023 was looking at the seeds. I have no confidence in this data at all, but I will share it because having undergrad students that are 19 years old looking for tiny seeds through a soil sample and they're not being paid for it is just not a good way to do science. So that being said, we use soil sieves basically. I bought sieves that could catch the juniper seedlings, and they'd take samples underneath the tree or in the open. They'd work those through the sieve, and then they'd have their juniper seeds at the end. So unsurprisingly, female trees have a whole lot of seeds underneath there. We weren't looking at if they're still viable or not, just any old juniper seed, compared to the open areas and of course the male trees. So we still have some seeds underneath the males, but compared to the open areas, very few seeds are getting out there. But again, it's all a numbers game. 2 seeds per square meter is not bad. And that's the kind of conditions you can get to for juniper expansion, right? It doesn't take much. Okay, we also did birds. So this was done in the winters of 2012 and 2013. We did variable point counts, so this is where you're at a fixed location. And winter bird counts are much more boring than summertime. point counts are all about how you detect and how far away birds are. In the summertime, almost 95% of our observations are audio. So you can identify these birds. There's an American robin 75 meters away. There's a Buick's wren 62 meters that way. When you're measuring the species and the distance it is away from you, you have a radius. So me to Paul, let's say that's 16, 17 feet. Now I've got a radius. I have one Paul within 17-foot radius of me. From that, I can calculate densities. Okay? And this is how we do a lot of bird monitoring type of work. Now again, in the wintertime, there's a lot less going on. There's just lower diversity. Birds aren't singing as much. Luckily, mountain bluebirds and robins and solitaires like to make a lot of noise. We had 23 overwintering potential dispersers that we observed. So this is excluding things like raptors and things like that. But 75% of the observations of individual birds were thrushes. And of that, it's really the big three here: Townsend solitaires, mountain bluebirds, American robins. There's a handful of western bluebirds. Western bluebirds like a little bit more of a mix of deciduous trees around. So you'll find a lot of western bluebirds in the wintertime around cottonwoods, elms, kind of a nice mix. You're not going to find them too often in the juniper savanna, but mountain bluebirds, robins are just everywhere. I mean, like huge rolling flocks, 300 birds to a flock. I mean, really incredible numbers. If you think pinon jays are gregarious, no. Robins and bluebirds are incredible. So we were interested in looking at their habitat use and their densities. So the three most commonly encountered thrushes exhibited dissimilar preferences of landform or habitat type. Basically, I've got these color-coded, which is convenient. Mountain bluebirds are blue, robins are in red, solitaires are in gray. The savanna sites had really high numbers or occurrences of bluebirds. This is basically the percentage of time you would encounter that bird on a given point. So 90% of the time, if you were in the high elevation savanna, you were going to see a bluebird. 70% of the time in the low elevation savanna, you were going to get bluebirds. Solitaires, though, look at this. 20% of the time, oftentimes these were very distant observations. You've probably all heard a solitaire before. They go whoop, whoop, whoop. So I'll talk about their ecology in a second. So you can hear them pretty far away. Robins are kind of across the board. They're kind of in all these, and that's kind of what we generally know about them. They're kind of habitat generalists anyway. Solitaires, as their name suggests, are pretty solitary. You need a lot of these birds to be able to calculate density. We didn't get that for solitaires. So we only really looked at densities for bluebirds and robins. This is birds per hectare. Okay, so if you wanted to get birds per acre, basically divide that by 2. High elevation savannas, high numbers of robins and bluebirds. Escarpment areas, high numbers of robins, lower numbers of bluebirds. Low elevation savannas, higher numbers of bluebirds. Okay. So any kind of birder kind of would make these kind of observations. Townsend solitaires tend to be territorial. They're single. During the winter months, they find a nice patch, usually of Rocky Mountain juniper, scopulorum, and they post up in that area. They almost always have a high perch. If you've ever seen a solitaire, it's probably on top of a dead ponderosa or something, right? They're up there. They're watching their territory. When you have two solitaires getting in each other's territory, they'll start to squabble and they'll fight each other off. So they're going to be kind of single in these more escarpment woodland preferences. Robins form these kind of big gregarious flocks. They are habitat generalists, found in substantial numbers everywhere. And bluebirds were really preferential to the savanna structure. The lower the density, the more bluebirds you got. Okay? They're kind of always in these actively expanding juniper savanna areas where there's lots of visibility. And in the afternoon, you would see them foraging on the ground. And here's, of course, one on a yucca in this case. They really stand out. You know, in February, March, out there on the shortgrass prairie, there's nothing quite like the blueness of a mountain bluebird. They are incredible. So traditionally, when we're learning about birds and habitat, we often say, well, you know, a cottonwood gallery forest should have this kind of bird assemblage, and the birds go there because the habitat looks a certain way. Or the juniper savanna is like that. The bluebirds prefer to just go hang out in the savanna. But this presents an interesting kind of dynamic, this sort of symbiotic, mutualistic relationship, where mountain bluebirds are eating juniper berries, they're dispersing juniper berries, they're literally creating their habitat, right? When a bluebird consumes that seed, it disperses the seed, the juniper population expands and grows over the course of a century. These trees can live a couple hundred years, right? That increases the juniper seed production, thus increasing the bluebird's food resource. Birds in the wild like these might live 5 years, okay? So you have these small birds, they're tiny, right? They're living for about 5 years, but their actions during the winter time are influencing these century-old forests over time. So it's kind of a fun, positive feedback kind of loop, right? That you've got mountain bluebirds consuming junipers, leading to more dispersal, leading to more junipers, leading to more potential consumption. So frugivores, or fruit-eating birds, are probably the most influential birds on the planet in terms of determining ecosystems. We know a lot about this with tropical ecosystems. Frugivores in the tropics are super important. Things like toucans, the tanagers, all those species are dispersing seeds throughout the forest, right? We don't really think about them for this. So what's the management implication of this? If we want to save our grasslands, we should shoot some bluebirds, right? Right? Yeah. No, of course not. No, obviously not. That's also illegal. They're migratory species. Do not do that. Okay. The real implications of this. For juniper populations, the stand structuring fits that regeneration wave, leap and fill kind of model, gives good evidence for that kind of thing. Savannas don't appear to have been a natural habitat type. This is one that's still kind of a controversial statement. Juniper savannas have always probably been around in some degree, like near those escarpments, but in terms of the widespread savannas you see in Guadalupe County or San Miguel or Mora County, we're talking about millions of acres of this stuff. That's very different from how it used to be. Obviously, the dispersal ecology of junipers is such that if there's a break in fire regime, the birds are always waiting. The seeds are always probably getting into those landscapes. It's not until we kind of tweak those landscapes that they start to manifest themselves. Juniper populations will likely continue to expand. The work I did with my students, we've got seedlings that are 3 years old out there. And again, we're in hot, dry times. There's very few climatic conditions that will stop juniper seeds from germinating. Unless you're trying to do it in your yard for landscaping, in which case it won't work. Something like that, right? So dispersal into open areas isn't really limited. We're still getting seeds out there. The more we know about rodents and ants and all these other secondary dispersers, there's plenty of ways for seeds to get into those open areas, even if there's not a perch, even if it's far away from a seed packet of like bear scat, right? And the trees don't really require a nurse plant. Perches probably enhance seedling recruitment, but again, are not really necessary. We'll still see fences, cholla, telephone poles. That's a big one. High line power lines, just amazing numbers of seedlings underneath it. Incredible. Okay, really, really wild. And they have a diverse thrush assemblage. Mountain bluebirds, robins, and solitaires are all population-wise very stable. These are not species in decline like with our Pinon jay populations. So there's really nothing stopping the animal disperser standpoint. We should expect that. So restoration efforts should, if we're looking at restoring grasslands, doing ecological restoration, we should probably try to get the most bang for our buck in terms of focusing on those actively expanding far savannas. It's a lot easier to treat young trees like this than those big monster trees growing at the base of the escarpment, right? When projects are looking at treating junipers that are already mature, you're talking about either a hand crew going out there for like $3,000 or $4,000 an acre to treat that kind of thing. A bulldozer is still going to run you like $1,200 to $1,500 an acre to push the trees over. That's the main method that things like the NRCS will do for brush control. When you push over a big mature female juniper tree, you have now released the entire seed bed and the seedlings that are already there. So we see that a lot. These pushed over junipers on a project, there's already seedlings coming up, there's bird poop on the dead juniper itself. I mean, you're going to have to redo that in about 2 decades, right? So it's not really cost effective. And they're kind of getting away from that. This model is becoming more and more widespread in the land management agencies of really active focusing on places where you're going to get the most bang for your buck again. There's good evidence that savannas were formerly fire-regulated grasslands. Those natural fire regimes should, in cases where it's appropriate, be restored to restore those natural ecosystem structure. At least that's the cheapest way to go about restoring grassland. And then this is a problematic phrase, obviously, but I've included it because it is interesting, this idea that the natives are restless, but not often and only when disturbed. This is actually a title of a research paper by Dr. Simberloff. He's at University of Tennessee. He's a very well-known ecologist on invasive species. And they wrote this really interesting paper that looked at when we have native plants that are quote-unquote acting like invasives, right? They're doing things that the humans don't like, things that the humans don't work with our sort of management style. So the idea here is that native plants can in fact move, and they will respond to human changes in the landscape. If you take away fire from this landscape, if you take away pressures that are going to eat those seeds or reduce seed dispersal, then you should expect that you're going to get dispersal. These birds are going to do their thing, the trees are going to do their thing, and you're going to get this kind of situation. Conservation implications from a wildlife standpoint, it's really interesting to think about. I've done a lot of summertime bird surveys, how many years now? 12 years of bird surveys. And I still do the USGS breeding bird survey routes for Pecos and Variadero, kind of this area. And when you're out there in the summertime, you almost never see mountain bluebirds. They're only a winter species. But the activities of birds like bluebirds and pack rats and other secondary dispersers, their activities in the wintertime are affecting not only centuries worth of tree expansion, but affecting other vertebrate animals. Birds like long-billed curlew that really, really prefer nice, wide-open, true shortgrass steppe or shortgrass prairie without much tree cover. Hornlarks tend to decrease whenever you have more increased tree cover. Western meadowlarks tend to decrease when you have increased tree cover. Pronghorn, the same thing. But then you have other generalist species, sage thrashers, kingbirds, flickers, thrashers. All of these are going to be increasing potentially with the advent of juniper habitat. While I was doing this project, this bird right here, this photo, this is a crystal thrasher. This was the first crystal thrasher ever seen in San Miguel County. This is a bird species we're actually looking at in northern New Mexico. The first one in Taos County was seen last year. The first one in Rio Arriba County was seen about 6 years ago. They appear to be moving northward, and they use juniper habitat. So for some species, this is actually an okay thing. More tree cover, it's all right. For other species of concern, like gray vireos or blue-gray gnatcatchers, we still don't really know how this kind of affects them. They typically like juniper savannas in general, so probably a net positive for them, but not necessarily. So a lot of people helped on this, like lots of students. And I failed to get this last picture in here, but I didn't talk at all today about piñón, okay? Different process with piñón. I'm happy to talk about that on a later date. But there's a lot of these kinds of processes that we've kind of seen here still hold up for piñón jays. It's a different dispersal style. They're going to be caching those seeds, right? It's not just them pooping out. There's a lot more predators of piñón seeds. But here in the Taos area, we do have a lot of young piñón cropping up throughout the sagebrush. Part of the reason for that, I think, of why we see more piñón rather than juniper, Taos area gets more of a 50-50 precipitation winter to summer. Out on the eastern plains, where this work was done, it's like 70% of the precip comes in the summertime. That tends to favor juniper, whereas a 50-50 winter-summer precip tends to favor piñón, likes it a little bit colder. It also tends to favor sagebrush, which likes more of that winter precip. That's why we see it so much in the Great Basin. So kind of different processes, but again, there's a lot of similarities there with the two. The difference being, however, that unlike junipers and robins and bluebirds, we know that piñón have taken a beating over the last 20 years. The 2001 drought, when in Ips confusus or piñón bark beetle outbreak, killed about 30% of the trees, the state's piñón, like across all of New Mexico. The 2011 drought killed off another 5 to 10% probably. So we have a declining piñón population And we have a declining pinon jay population. Pinon jays' breeding cycles are very different than bluebirds. They're breeding in pinon juniper landscapes year-round. The young will stay back with the adults and help raise the young sometimes for a year. If there's not a good pinon crop for multiple years, they'll just leave. They'll go somewhere else. So you have these situations where, let me just go back here. Unlike the positive feedback loop of junipers and mountain bluebirds, something like pinon and pinon jay is kind of more of a negative feedback loop. When pinons start to die off, there's less of that food resource. Pinon jays have to go somewhere else. Now there's less pinon jays on the landscape. Who's dispersing those seeds? Scrub jays are still around. Scrub jays don't fly nearly as far as pinon jays. They don't cache as many seeds. They literally can't hold as many in their gullet as a pinon jay can. So a lot of differences there with pinon. Okay, with that, I think I'm done. Thank you all for your attention. Any questions? Paul?
On one of your slides, you had a little bit of data about ponderosa pine
Uh-huh.
going in on those grasslands.
So that was a good question. That was, actually, I don't know what your question is, but let me go back to that. Good point. That was, so this area where we did this was at Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge, so not far away from where the rest of the research took place, but it was right at the ecotone boundary, and we did have a few ponderosa at 7,000 feet in grasslands. Big apple-shaped, bushy, you know how ponderosa get when they're growing in those kind of soils. So we did have a handful of these. All of the stuff that happened down in the Conchas country, lower elevation, there was old ponderosa up in the escarpment. And actually, if you go out, let me go back here. If you go out to these escarpments, they are very guarded, but there are aspen on the Canadian escarpment in eastern San Miguel County that are about 40 miles from the mountains themselves. How long those aspen have been there, who knows? They're at seeps, they're at permanent seeps. The ones that I've seen are a lot of dead and down. There's a few live ones still around, but presumably those trees have been there for a very, very long time. So there is still some ponderosa in this kind of area, but it tends to be high. But that's not your question. What's
No, I was just wondering, I was surprised
Yeah.
that they were there at all.
Yeah. So that was a slightly higher elevation site, but yeah, those aspen groves are incredible, truly. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
As far as dispersion, what about sheet flows during the heavy monsoon?
Yeah, certainly, you know, they're buoyant, so certainly during drainages, you'll see them during drainages, but on sheet flows themselves, you know, think about the timing of the ripening of the fruit, the seeds themselves. They tend to, like most fruits, they ripen fall through the winter time when they are a very attractive food source. So most of our torrential downpour rains that are going to have sheet flows, summertime, you'll see a few berries on the trees, but they're not ripe yet. They tend to cling to the tree very well.
So how long do the seeds typically remain viable?
Decades. Yeah, I mean, you know, like with most species, the viability decreases with time, but they did some work back in the 40s where these seeds might be viable for 40, 50 years or longer. The germination rates increase when they pass through the gut of an animal. The pericarp is stripped. It's basically a form of scarification, and so you get better germination rates after the seed has gone through a bird or a mammal. It's a myth that goats will eat the juniper berries and the seeds are killed. That's not true. That's very much not true. They'll pass through anybody, even me. Even my students. I always have students that eat them. I did have one student that had an allergic reaction one time to eating juniper berry. That was scary. I was like, for years I told all the students, yeah, try one, eat one, and no problems. And then I had one student, immediately they were like, I'm getting itchy. And I was like, I need to take you somewhere. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Mary.
Who's making the decisions on land management for either grassland or allowing junipers to grow?
It's entirely contextual of you know, who the land belongs to, how active a manager they are. You know, some properties are really into burning. and have done cool prescribed fire programs and have really nice healthy grasslands. But that's a liability. That's taking a pasture out of production for a year. Big cost hit, honestly. So it tends to be, you don't tend to see that as wide as often. In general, BLM did more of this kind of active management on junipers, I would say more like in the 70s and 80s. That's kind of slowed down in more recent years. But for private lands, like where this is at, it'd be private lands in NRCS. Yeah. Any other questions? That was a lot to throw at everybody. When I was making this, I was like, ooh, that's a lot of graphs and things. But it was like multiple questions and, that kind of thing. So, yeah, thanks. Yeah, right. Yes, sir.
Some things that you've stated here that kind of might address some issues that we've run into. My wife she works on a master's program around PJ.
Huh?
But I also work with local thinning groups.
Huh?
And a lot of the land that we do, I'd say about 60% or so is P&J areas up in San Cristobal and so forth. And what I've noticed is more often than not, if there's a forester that comes through, they mark for being cut every juniper that's
Yeah.
And I have yet to find someone in the Forest Service that can explain to me
Why they want to take them out.
all of them without, all of them give this kind of blanketed response that juniper somehow is very negative tree,
Yeah.
very aggressive. This is the terminology
Yeah.
they use. So part of what maybe, but I'm not sure, they're looking at is if you're talking about a P&J, I'll say,
Nice.
instead of JP, environment or forest area,
Mhm.
they might be thinking that because of competition, the junipers need to go. But what I've seen is we have two different areas up in San Cristobal and acres and acres of area that was cleared where only pinon is left versus areas that are adjacent, where
Mhm.
there's pinon and juniper. First thing you notice is the bird life.
Absolutely. So even during the breeding season, if you don't have pinon and juniper together, your breeding bird diversity is lower. You want them both. Oftentimes they are nesting in junipers and foraging in pinon, a lot of these species. Wintertime, you're losing all those berries, so you're losing all the fruit of that would be robins. Yeah, there's a lot of old school thinking out there of just get the junipers suck up the water, got to get rid of the junipers. They compete too much. Well, if you're in those kind of San Cristobal, there's the fire reduction part, and that thinning's great. But if it's like a blanket taken out of the juniper, there's no real ecological reason why. If you've got Rocky Mountain juniper there and pinon there, they're going together. And further than that, when we're thinking about climate change, that whole area in El Salto area where all those big conifers are dying, those trees are not long for this world. And what's coming in is juniper and pinon because that's with the lower elevation. We would expect a northward and higher elevation shift of tree cover. Junipers and pinon for climate change, for big fires like the Herman's Peak Calf Canyon fire, I'd expect those bird dispersed seeds, pinon and juniper, are going to make a big comeback on forest rather than wind-blown ponderosa and firs and things like that. They can really get in there a lot quicker. So as far as being climate adapted, it's not a bad tree to have around.
One of my other thoughts is if you have another outbreak of hips,
Yeah,
you've got nothing left.
you've got nothing left. Those areas where it's just pinon, and there's a lot of that actually as you drive around I-25 south of Las Vegas, south of Bernal, sort of between Bernal and Pecos. There's a big stretch in the middle of the highway median, and it's where everyone goes to pick pinon. Like it's a famous pinon. They thinned it out 10 years ago and took out every single juniper in that stretch, and now it's a nice. It looks nice when you're driving by it, but it's straight pinon. And I agree that we have not seen the last of bark beetle outbreaks of pinon die off due to drought. That's not going to go away. Yeah. Yeah.
So what are the management goals? Are they ecologically based? Are they to create grasslands?
Yeah, so again, it's all context dependent. For the case of a lot of this kind of stuff, we are looking at areas that were formerly grasslands that are simply not now. So if your goal is from a ecological standpoint, thinning out these areas that were formerly grasslands, that's probably a good goal to have from a holistic ecosystem wildlife standpoint. From a range production and agriculture standpoint, also beneficial. When you take out trees, there is a inverse relationship between grass cover and juniper cover in these ecosystems. If you were to go through here and treat these junipers, your grass response, I've seen it, it happens. You're going to have more grass.
So if your goal is ecological,
Mm-hmm.
then it seems like an effort to go back in time instead of to look at the evolution of the ecosystem. Right?
Yeah.
Because fires aren't on their way down,
Right.
you know, and so we've managed to suppress for a while, but
They're on the increase,
just
yeah.
left them alone,
Yeah.
they would respond in a more natural way.
Right. Well, I mean, this whole area has not burned yet, but it will. I mean, you know, increasingly, we don't tend to hear about fires out in these areas on the news as much. One, because they're on private land. They're not up in the forests that everybody kind of knows. And in eastern New Mexico, there's just not as many people. But, some of those big fires that have been out in Mosquero the last couple of years, those areas burned a lot of juniper country, and almost nobody talked about those fires at all. Because they took place on private lands, and they manage those fires. So increasingly we see agencies doing managed fire, right? They're not just doing the 48-hour put out the fire thing. They're going to say, well, can we shape that fire? Can we let that burn for a while? And especially in these ecosystems, that's probably a good idea. And we see them doing that more and more. Yeah.
I'm kind of new to Taos, and so many people have told me, oh, this used to be all grassland. And is there a goal in mind? If I go north, up towards Hondo, was that ever grassland?
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
what about sage? I look at a landscape like this, and I see the juniper all right, and grass. But what happens to the sagebrush? And how did that become so invasive?
Yeah. So again, So I hesitate to use the word invasive because it is a native plant. Sagebrush was probably always around in this area. It certainly has increased in the last couple centuries. For the case of sagebrush, you're looking at a smaller plant. It's wind-dispersed seeds. They're both allelopathic. They both kind of tend to inhibit germination, but because sagebrush, you get more of that wall-to-wall coverage, that effect is like higher. So in terms of treating sagebrush on a big scale, I don't think we have the funds or the will to do that. On projects like on Tract 1B out the Pueblo, on your way out to the gorge, you pass by a big section where they treated it 20-something years ago, maybe more. So that area got treated. That's very energetically expensive. It's difficult to do that.
Oh, like in a treated area, they have it return to grassland?
Yes, that was the so to
Opinion, is juniper out of that also, and just?
Yeah, so in those areas, it always depends on whatever the land management agency or owner's goal is. But the goal on those projects was to return that to grassland for both productivity-wise, but also in game-wise and forage and just having it be grassland again. It's
That,
yeah.
it just seems so confusing. Like, do we want the birds, or do we want the trees, or?
Well, in those areas, like in the sage flats from here to Tres Piedras, juniper not necessarily except for in the drainages and rocky outcrops, not really an appropriate vegetation type. Those are deep, well-drained soils. Historically, those were cool season bunch grasses probably, or heavily dominated by those. So we wouldn't want to see tree cover in those areas necessarily. Sagebrush in our region, because we're not in the Great Basin, like we don't have sage grouse here. We don't have those species that are really, like we have sage thrasher and curve-bill thrasher. There's a handful of species out there, but it's not like we've got a lot of sagebrush obligate species like you see in the Great Basin. So if it was all grassland, from an ecosystem productivity, from a wildlife standpoint, it would be a more lively place, I would say, with the grassland. That's the biggest difference I see coming from the Las Vegas side to here is you go out in these grasslands, some days it's like you're on safari. I mean, there's pronghorn everywhere and elk everywhere. It's amazing. You go to those sage flats and it's like not a lot going on, you know? Yeah.
It's my understanding that it was the overgrazing by sheep that led to the loss of grasslands and hence allowed space.
Allowed the sagebrush, yeah. Yeah, that's certainly,
Sage grows all the way to Montana.
yeah, it's all over.
Southern Canada.
Yeah.
So it's just moving south. when
Yeah.
the Grassland disappeared.
Right. Yeah.
So why isn't there sage there?
No, it's, I would say there's actually very little sagebrush out here, like any kind of pockets of it. So there's just not really a seed source of it, but also that more summer-dominated moisture regime tends to be more, sagebrush just doesn't do well. Grass does well here. Like out on those eastern plains, it's good grass country. It grows grass really well. And you get to some areas that have been really well managed, and it's like blue grama buffalo grass sod, and it's incredible. I mean, and that kind of grass sod helps to keep out woody plants from germinating, and the seeds literally just get on the grass and stay on the surface, and they're going to dry out and desiccate. Yeah. So yeah, this area, we've got chamisa in limited areas, rabbit brush, but yeah, very little sage. You don't hit sagebrush again until you get to western Kansas. If anyone's ever been to like the Morton or Elkhart area of Kansas, there's some sagebrush stands out there that are interesting. They're kind of like sandy hills.
Do you have,
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
do you have any oak or maple savanna out that way?
No, the oak tends to be at the rock outcrops. You get a little bit nearby in the drainages, but yeah, very little. Yeah, very little. Yeah, Paul was asking, do you get anything like an oak savanna out in that area? And we certainly have a lot of oak in here. So there's both Gambeli and Grisia and undulata. There's 3. Thank you. So yeah, wavy leaf oak, gray oak, and gamble oak. You can find all 3 of those in here. But yeah, it tends to stick to the rocky outcrops. Yeah. Yeah, your other question?
Yeah, so this is on a micro scale in town, and I have an acre of land, not a lot, but it's just a mess. And I want to establish more grasses.
Yeah.
there. But without watering very much, how do I do that?
So think about the sagebrush as a response to things that happened in the past, and it is the appropriate vegetation type for now. It is really hard to establish grass out there. You can do it. You could brush hog that area. There have been some projects where they go out, they brush hog, then they seed it in. You could start with a dryland cover crop mix. Native grass seeds are very difficult to get to germinate with a piece of equipment, in my experiences. So we tend to kind of find species that have been kind of naturalized. You'll see crested wheatgrass all over the place around here. Crested wheatgrass does very well in those kind of soils. I'm not even sure crested wheatgrass is native to this area. This would be the group to ask.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, but it does really well. It persists in the soil, so we see that in the area, and it tends to stick around for a long time.
Or something like that can start it in a small area?
Yeah, and it'll spread, and there are people that grow blue grama that can hook you up in this room right now. Right there.
Paul Cross.
The blue grama is an amazing grass. It is the state grass for a reason. It is what kept New Mexico from blowing away during the Dust Bowl. It's an incredible species of plant. And so the more blue grama you can get out there in landscape, the better. We did that soil health workshops a couple weekends ago when Ray Archuleta and Alejandro Carrillo were in town. We went out to the Double D Ranch, which they're now calling the Regeneration Ranch. It's not that cool of a name. I can't believe they changed the name of a historic ranch. Anyway, but we found stands of blue grama out there. So there is blue grama out there. There is some buffalo grass out there. It's in pockets. So it persists, but it's certainly, not super dense. Yeah. Yeah, of course. There's a whole lot more about juniper I'd love to talk about. If you guys want to look into this, there's a species of gall midge called, thanks Phil, called Walsomia, and they're juniper urn midges. And you can look for them this time of year. You can also look for Pinyonia aegylicola, which is another gall midge that grows on pinon needles. So look around at your juniper and pinon. The juniper, look for something that looks like a berry, but has it's the size of a berry, but it's like cupped and then it's open at one end. That's a gall midge. There's a little larvae in there. Pinyonia aegylicola, there's a species of very tiny midge, or it's a hymenoptera, so it's a wasp, and they lay it right in the base of the needle. So your pine needles will turn like a beautiful red at the base and then go back to green. There's a larvae in there too. So the more you look around your pinon juniper, there's lichen in there. There's like galls in there. There's all kinds of cool insects in there. There really are neat plants. Juniper is my favorite plant. All this about restoring them and everything, they're my number one favorite plant by a mile. They're like the most hardy. When the cold came, we got those big cold snaps, nothing happens to them. Drought, nothing happens to them. They're cool. If anyone wants to get a hold of me, you can always call into the extension office. You can also always just Google us. We show up pretty quick on Google. And my email is... almost there. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your attention and patience.